The board has let the committee, the conference committee, get a keynote speaker, and we looked long and far and found Peter. And so we feel very fortunate to hear from him today. He is a futurist and a tech expert. He's a strategic foresight advisor, thought leader, author, writer, and serial entrepreneur and former journalist. Peter has spent his career in a wide range of roles, figuring out the future, explaining what's probably coming next, and helping envision how we can build a better world. He came to San Francisco at the beginning of the digital revolution to work with founders of Wired magazine. He then learned the future's business, working with the founders of the pioneering strategic foresight from Global Business Network, and eventually founded 2 of his own media startups focused on the future. Peter's considered a thought leader on the future, on the impact of new technologies, and on the repercussions of megatrends. He has worked for 25 years as a futurist and tech expert through Kepler speakers, giving keynotes on roughly a monthly basis throughout Americas. He's written 2 influential books on the future that went into multiple languages, and most recently written popular online pieces like The Great Progression, 2025 to 2050. He is regularly interviewed on the media and podcasts. We feel very fortunate, and he is a senior advisor on strategic foresight operations through his firm Reinvent Futures. He frequently takes what he learns about the future and helps work with senior leaders of different organizations think through the strategic implications of what's coming as they put together their own strategy and preparedness. Peter, please come up. Okay.
Wow. Thank you. Ooh, thank you for it. You got it picked up here? There we go. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm very, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me down to Houston. I just came in yesterday from San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, where I've been rooted for over 25 years, as she mentioned there. I'm also thrilled, actually, that there's this online audience. 2 of those startups that she said I founded and ran, both of them were really rooted in helping pioneer the early online video world. First with this thing called YouTube that no one understood, and I was actually using it to actually get conferences like this back out cheaply and more easily than you could have done previously. And also my second startup was essentially founded in 2012, the same year as Zoom, and it was trying to pioneer the early interactive world of video that we now know as through Zoom, basically. So anyhow, I'm happy to see both online and here, you folks. The other thing which is really something for someone like me is I usually end up speaking to audiences that really have very little idea about the field of strategic foresight, to really be thinking about the future systematically and more rigorously. And so with you folks, I actually have a lot of commonality. She mentioned this company, Global Business Network, that I worked with the founders there, and I'm going to mention a couple of them later here. But essentially that company, particularly one of the founders and CEOs, Peter Schwartz, learned the scenario planning business at Shell Oil with the legendary Pierre Vac. And Peter took what he learned through Shell and brought it into the Bay Area and basically started this company called Global Business Network. And that was at that place that I both wrote a book with Peter, but also learned the trade basically there, along with another guy called Stuart Brand, which I'll get into in a little bit now here too. Now, one of the beauties of, let's see here, there we got my thing, yep. There we go. One of the beauties of being able to kick off here is, and also you folks are super efficient. In fact, we're ahead of schedule here. Normally, it's hard enough to herd cats on a conference like this and get them in the room here. But not only that, but your first 2 speakers went right through. So we have plenty of time here to go over kind of my keynote here, in which I have a lot of slides and a lot of information, and I'm going to touch on a lot of different fields. I'm going to give you kind of the big picture, long-term look at the next, particularly the next 25, but 10 to 25 years. And like I said, we speak a lot of the same languages because I've kind of the decision-making space, from what I understand, and from last night at the cocktail party. Share a lot of between many, I'm going to actually try to lay out to you today in this talk that is called The Great Progression. It is written in this magazine piece that she made a quick reference to, which I'll also talk about briefly. But it's essentially a much more comprehensive look at the next 25 years. And I'm not only with this piece, which I will reference later, but also I'm going to try to lay out to you in a more comprehensive way what I actually think is going to break out across many, many fields basically the world in the next 25 years. It's a kind of, call it a positive scenario. Maybe in your world you might think of it as more of a positive scenario, but I would call it actually closer to a work of speculative fiction. Or not speculative fiction, speculative journalism. I'm basically going to be analyzing trends that are actually happening now and actually playing out where I think they could well go. So I'm actually talking about I think it's happening and will happen. Now, will it be 100% right? No. But I think it's going to help you folks expand your thinking about what's possible here in the next 25 years. Now, I would be remiss without at least touching, now, here we are, March 2023, without mentioning that I really actually think what's been happening in the last 6 months here around generative AI has been a really phenomenal thing. I'm coming out of Silicon Valley and I'm coming out of the Bay Area, and I will say week by week by week, all this energy and all this thinking around what's happening with generative AI has really, I think, tipped the balance towards a phenom that I really think is going to have a huge impact basically on your industry, as well as many other kind of industries. And I would say up until about 6 months ago, I was talking about AI in a more generic way of what's going to happen when we have kind of ubiquitous AI and all the ways AI could ultimately affect us. But I will say in the last 6 months, we're actually it's now hit. We're actually seeing a thing that people were speculating on actually starting to actually hit. And it has been blowing away many people I trust in the tech world. And I've been in this thing for over 30 years now. And I've watched a lot of craziness like with crypto and metaverse. And people go nutty about a bunch of things. But this one is one that is really hitting the folks that I really trust most. And it's actually really affecting me. And I've been very kind of, open-minded, but very kind of cautious on some of these other kind of manias. In fact, this one is, I think, the real deal. And so anyhow, one of the reasons I just did this is I basically had DALL-E, the kind of ChatGPT kind of open AI visual tool. I just said, hey, make a guy named Stuart Brand, one of the other co-founders of GB Ed, as a superhero. And I just did it last night quickly. And basically, boom, they came up with this. And I just wanted to kind of say, I think we're actually opening up a new age of AI, and I'm going to reference that throughout the whole talk here, but I did want to say, particularly for decision-making, this is the thing that's going to really affect your field, and we're going to talk a little bit about those implications, but I think next year's forum you'll have here will be, you'll have a thorough kind of like working this through, because this is really hitting fast, it's hitting a lot of different spaces, and it will definitely hit yours. Now, what I'm going to do in the more bigger picture, not just the AI picture, is what I do is I do basically 4 things in these talks, these keynote talks like this. And there's an ambitious agenda. I try to talk to you about what I think is what's really going on. And I gave you a little bit of sense of that about a positive reframe around the kind of gloom and doom that most people see. But this is the key thing. I'm going to basically talk to you what I think is probably coming in the next 10 years. And I got a really good track record on that, and I'm going to kind of try to convince you on my track record before we go into some of the stuff going forward. I'm going to talk to you what I think is possible to achieve in the next 25 years as these kind of things that shift in the next 10 years start scaling up, particularly in regards to solving some of these great challenges we have along with climate change. And I'm going to make reference from time to time on what you could do. But again, it's stretching your thinking, so what you could do is maybe something you could think about throughout the rest of your program here over the next 3 days. There'll be plenty to think about. And also, we're going to have a lot of Q&A here. So at the end of my time here, I was laying all this stuff out so we can churn it out here with you folks. That is essentially what my company, which is I would call it a strategic foresight company. It's a Reinvent Futures. That's what we basically do. I spend a lot of time with senior leaders, particularly C-suites, boards, people that kind of really can make a difference in their companies, help them really think through these 4 questions, which tend to be actually quite valuable. If you can get pretty accurate information on that, which is not what your competition has, it's useful in terms of what to do there. Now, that said, what I'm going to basically talk to you in kind of a short version here, I'm just going to give you a kind of quick overview, is I think one of the reasons we're trapped, so many people are trapped in this negative way of what's going on in the world and where the world's going, as opposed to a positive way, is we're caught in essentially an amazing decade. That is really the transition between 2 kind of eras. And I would say if you had to describe the last 40 years, and looking by the demographics here, a lot of you kind of had your careers through the last 40 years, or at least came of age in the last 40 years and began your careers, however you think about it. But my career has literally spanned essentially a mega system that was made up of all these subsystems that interconnected and actually made sense of the world. And so we had, again, if you think about from the American perspective or the Western perspective, because I understand there's about 20% of your organization is from outside the country, but in general, so I would say the kind of a Western obsession in terms of a challenge was terrorism. Our energy, and again, I know there's a lot of oil companies in this group here too, it was clearly carbon. It was kind of the cresting of essentially a century of that, or a century and a half of carbon. Transportation was totally the internal combustion engine. Culture was very baby boomer centric, the biggest generation in American history. Every time it went through a developmental stage, it changed the culture. Politics was largely conservative, partly because of those boomers, honestly, and who tended to be more conservative than, in fact, the 60s kind of everyone thought it was all this radical crew. It wasn't that. Economics, because of that more conservative politics, was kind of unleashing the private sector, deregulation, tax cutting kind of concepts. Capitalism was very much about shareholder capitalism, and in fact, a lion's share of a lot of the kind of wealth created in this last area went that way. Work was totally physical. I was always in physical places, downtown and all that kind of stuff, edge cities. Production was industrial. Again, the petrochemical industry has a lot to do with that. And politics was in the Middle East because we had to get the oil going, because the whole system would capture the whole flywheel of the whole thing had to work like that. Now, I'm going to argue, without being too provocative, that increasingly that system is going away. That is essentially a system that is already run. Many of the pieces of that are breaking down. Many of the things are running into trouble, not the least of which is we're running into climate change and other things there. But I'm just going to kind of say, now, a lot of these will play out for a while, but I'm saying the way to start thinking about this is, okay, that was more of a 20th century, late 20th century, early 21st system. The remarkable thing about this is that every one of those spaces has essentially a nascent new system that I would argue is building into essentially the next meta system, essentially. And now we're watching as a meta challenge is turning to climate change. Energy, again, it's a long and slow thing. It's going to be a long transition here, but it's shifting towards cleaner energies in all kinds of different ways, including nuclear. We're going to chat a little bit about that too. Transportation is moving to electric vehicles. We're going to go over a lot of those numbers fast. Culture is becoming much more dominated by the millennial generation, roughly the children of the boomers, but also a lot of immigrants in this country. That crew is really starting to dominate our culture, affecting it. Politics, this is where it gets a little touchy, but I'm just laying out a bunch of ideas for you to think about. I think it's going to go more progressive over time in this next era. That means I think you're going to see a much bigger role for the public sector, particularly around climate change and other things. You're already starting to see the versions of that with infrastructure bills and all kinds of things you wouldn't have seen the last 40 years. Capitalism is trying to incorporate all kinds of different folks. We're far from any kind of filling that out, but think about the next 25 to 50, to 40 years again. Work, since the pandemic, we've actually seen, oh my God, we could actually get much virtual. It's not to say it'll be all virtual, but we're going to watch a mix of virtual happen in this next cycle. Production is going to be increasingly biological. I know there's a lot of pharma people here and really thinking about the future of biotech. We're watching a whole new opening in that space. I'll talk more about that. And geopolitics is shifting to Asia, partly because for climate and all kinds of reasons you need to deal with those huge populations there, including with China and all the kind of things that are happening there. That whole system, I would argue, is essentially where we're starting to go. It's not exactly where we'll go, but ultimately that shift is what we're trapped in. This decade is we're watching this crazy shift going on across all these different things. And that's partly why people, if you're more thought in the old kind of system, you're seeing everything's falling apart and not working. If you're in this new system, you're starting to get very excited and look at all kinds of crazy opportunities. And for the business audiences, I don't know how many of you guys are rooted in business, but again, it depends how you think about it, but the opportunities that are opening up here are humongous, huge, and we're going to get into that. I would say, because of all that, that's how I come up with the idea that I think the next 25 years are going to be a crazy amount of what I would call essentially opening up a great era of progress, and a tremendous amount of opportunity and growth. Now, I'm going to go even further than this. This came out in this magazine piece from last fall, which you can just Google it or come to my website or get it. It's a very popular thing. A lot of people have been talking about this, in which a 10,000-word magazine piece basically go over all the pieces and other cases of what this tipping, essentially, between these two systems and how it's actually working and going to play out here. And so a lot of this I'm going to be talking about is rooted in that. Now, one of the drivers of that piece, which to kind of understand this better, is what's opening up are three tech booms. But essentially, all three of them are world historic tech booms that are starting to open up here. One of them is AI. So we've had this 40-year run of essentially the digital revolution, you could say, that got us to here, but we're just now opening up the next era of AI on top of that. And again, I made reference to that earlier. I'm going to talk a lot more about that later. The second thing has to do with energy. And obviously, as we're shifting from a more, completely carbon-based energy system to an increasingly clean one, which again, I'm going to have a lot of kind of transition between those two. But ultimately, there's also some on the horizon here, possibilities around nuclear energy, but particularly nuclear fusion, which is going to be a crazy development if we get to that. And it looks like we can actually get there, commercial versions of that relatively soon. We'll chat on that. And the third one has to do with biotech. Essentially synthetic biology and essentially biological engineering. There's a bunch of ways you talk about it. But essentially, all three of these are going to look, in history, will be seen as world historical new technologies, basically. And they're all just arriving now. So it's not out of the question to think that we are now watching the beginning of what, over time, will be understood as an age, literally, like the beginning of the AI age, meaning something that's going to open up for decades and decades and potentially centuries, will kind of play off this kind of idea of intelligent machines interacting with humans. And again, the starting gun just popped in the last 6 months here with something that's popular and open and everybody can try and all the industries can work on in a way that it wasn't available 6 months ago, or even a year ago or something like that. You could be speculating on, but we're now. But again, think about the next 25 years playing this out. Next thing is I do think it's going to be considered around these new technologies, but also around all kinds of products and all kinds of stuff. We're really entering a different kind of age where everything's going to have to be thought through in terms of its sustainable implications. This has been a debate for 20, 30 years even. But I think we're really watching tipping points here where that is going to infuse all kinds of developments. And then the third one I do think is we're entering a biological age, which I think ultimately will supersede an industrial age that we've really been playing in for the last 250 years since the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. All three of these are huge things. And I think they're all kind of starting at the same time. And again, adding up into a crazy kind of possibility here. Now, What that means in the short run, and this is the beauty of having all this time here to talk to you folks, is there's many sub-things that I think if you think about the next 25 years are going to happen. I call them the inexorables. It's not necessarily 100% inevitable, but essentially they're inexorably going to happen under almost any scenario, and when they're going to be hard to channel even, let alone stop. And for example, what you're going to see in the next 10 years is every human on the planet be connected through the internet. And I'm going to talk about all these in more depth. So I'm just going to touch on them very quickly here to give you a sense of it. We are going to watch ubiquitous, cheap AI, accessible by anybody, through that infrastructure that's going to be completed this decade. We are going to see accelerated innovation, and I'm going to explain why, and it's basically based on those two things. Those two things are going to add up to that. We are going to watch a transition increasingly to clean energies on all kinds of different fronts, and we got the numbers already playing out on that. We're going to see electric transportation. It's incredible what's happened in the last 5 years, and the entire global auto industry has transitioned within 5 years here. It's not a debate anymore. It's just like where everyone's going. We're going to see essentially a mastery of genetic understanding, not just of human genomes and an impact on healthcare, but you're going to watch it at all living things and essentially lead to synthetic biology. You're going to watch biological engineering. We're going to go from engineering inert things like materials to engineering living things. Already we know how to do that, and that thing is going to happen. We're going to watch a generational shift, which we're already watching here. It's going to play out in all kinds of ways, particularly in politics, in American politics, and also European politics. And we're going to see new majorities kind of push for totally different ways of doing things, which is essentially one that's, I think people are misunderstanding how fast that's going to happen. And I'm going to throw that out. It goes even beyond that. There are some mega trends, you could say, at a global level that are basically going to happen here. One is, we know inexorably it's going to get more and more complicated with climate change. I'm going to run over some quick numbers on that to remind you of that. I do actually think there's going to be plenty of capital to transition as fast as we need to go here, depending if we have the will to do that. We're going to deal with a Chinese superpower, which 25 years ago you wouldn't have had. It was essentially a developing world basket case almost. That's an inexorable thing and could lead to some kind of Cold War tensions, unfortunately, but we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to watch the entire planet go into cities. They figure by about 2050, it'll be about 70% of all humans will be in there, if not 80%. We're going to watch essentially middle-class majorities in the terms of a global middle class, which is essentially, not what you think of as American middle class, which is rich by global standards. But the idea is we're going to get most people will be out of extreme poverty in the next bit here, and they'll basically have enough to live decent lives. And I would say over time, what we saw in the West happen the last 40 years with the boomer gender kind of balance, which was a very difficult transition culturally, and we're going to see that go global. And I have numbers to show that. So anyhow, that's a crazy way to think about it. So in the biggest picture, which is a whole other talk I could do, which I won't, but I want to put it in even this bigger picture. If you go back to 1980 to 2100 through the whole century, I think people are basically, for the next 500, 1,000 years from now, they'll look back the way we look back on the Enlightenment, for example, or something, in the beginning of representative democracy. They're going to look back and they're going to say, that's when the world went all digital, with the extension of AI. That's when we essentially went fully global, or essentially working on a planetary scale. Again, this is through the whole century. And ultimately, I think we're going to go into something, if not totally sustainable, mostly sustainable. But I think those three meta shifts are world historical shifts that people will look back on literally forever. The way we look back on the Roman Empire, or we look back on the Enlightenment, or that kind of stuff. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that kind of things. That's the story we're in the middle of here. And I'm going to basically try to lay this out to you as fast as I can. So you say, okay, well, why would I listen to this guy, even if it sounds interesting, but why? So one of the things I want to say is, I've been through this drill before, and it worked pretty successfully, is I came to work with the founders of Wired magazine. And Wired in the early 90s to mid-90s, we were about the only place in the world that was really thinking through the full implications of the digital revolution, is what we called it. But essentially now has become the digital economy, or the digital transformation if you're a business, and things like that. Because people back in the mid-90s, take 95, they barely just knew what the web was or what email was, but they couldn't understand how a digital economy would work differently, or what would a goofball startup like an Amazon, what would that do? Why would that ever amount to anything? And so that was one piece. The second piece was the Soviet Union had just collapsed. China was just opening up its market to the capitalist economy. And people hadn't really thought through, well, what is this globalization thing? How will it really matter? What's the difference? What will it do? And so we had, so basically Wired, I was a senior editor there at the time. I got paired with a kind of pretty much one of the world's best premier futurists at the time, Peter Schwartz. Again, this guy who came out of Standard Shell Oil and mastered scenario planning and later formed this company, and at the time had that company, Global Business Network, which I later worked for. Anyhow, we came together and we thought through, decided to tell the story of the world from 1995 onward. And really the bigger way we talked about it was the story of the world from 1980, which is behind us, through 1995, which is when we were writing it, into 2020. And it turns out, damn, we were really actually close to this. And here's the other thing that was interesting. We put in 10 things that we called them scenario spoilers at the time, but it's 10 things that could go wrong in the world that would slow down or it seemed to work at cross purposes with these giant trends of kind of the digital revolution, the globalization trends. All 10 of them came about, by the way. And the internet's been having a fun time with this. Around 2020, when it first hit and stuff, people were dredging those up and saying, oh my God, everyone. One of them was a kind of, we predicted we'd have a global pandemic. Because, hey, all this globalized connection is probably going to have another global pandemic. Boom, hit that. We said, Russia, which had just kind of liberalized, said, it's possible, good chance they're going to slide back into kind of old style nationalism and threaten Europe again. And here we got the Ukraine war. Anyhow, a lot of them were just kind of interesting elaborations, the way you guys think about scenarios or start thinking it through. We laid them out, 10 of them, all 10 of them nailed. Which, if we had more time, I could go into all those things. But one of the things the positive things we had projected here also came through. And even all those negative things could not slow down these things that we said, hey, this is going to happen. One was the doubling of computer power every 2 years. And which essentially, this is a logarithmic scale, just to point out. In other words, it would have to be up to, skyscraper to watch this thing go up. But basically, we watched the doubling of computer power continue all the way to 2020. It was actually remarkable. I mean, you could kind of project it, but you thought, it's a lot of things could have gone wrong on that. It didn't. It kept going. The flip side was the cost came down dramatically. Again, a log scale. Just a reminder, in 1980, 1 gigabyte cost, what was it, $700,000. It's like a penny today. Every one of you is carrying around hundreds of gigabytes in your cell phone right there. That came down. Boom. Again, that wasn't necessarily going to absolutely happen. Internet. 1995, there was basically 25 million, it was all Americans basically on the internet. And now it's basically, by 2020, it was roughly 60% of the world, 4 billion people. That happened, that was not inevitable necessarily. Apple, when that cover story at Wired came out, Apple literally that month begged Steve Jobs to come back as CEO because they were 3 months away from going bankrupt. And so Jobs came back, as you know, had this vision, and ultimately Apple became the first trillion-dollar company in the world, with a T, which there had never been a trillion-dollar company in the world. Again, go back just 10 years, roughly 10 years ago, this is 2011, and here again, the crowd here, a lot of rooted in energy. The most valuable companies in the world at that time, just then, was essentially three energy companies. That was the other one there is a Chinese bank, and basically Apple, which had just done the iPhone in 2008, right? 10 years later, boom, all the most valuable companies in the world were West Coast American tech companies, 3 in the Bay Area, 2 in Seattle. All of them were worth $1 trillion, basically. Ultimately, Facebook got there. Again, trillions. There hadn't been companies that had ever hit trillions to this time. But it wasn't just the tech sector. GDP growth went through the entire sector of the U.S. That little dip there is just the pandemic, which bounced back. China had $1 trillion GDP in 1995. It was with 1.3 billion people. It was a middling developing country with basically most of their population in extreme poverty. And they later became the most second superpower, basically, in the space of those same 25 years. Again, not a thing that was necessarily going to happen. Global, it wasn't just China, went through all kinds of global growth. That little downturn is simply the pandemic, which has bounced back. And here's the other thing, the stock market boom. We weren't really particularly talking about the stock market, but our book, by the way, that story went into a book, which I co-authored with Schwartz, went into multiple languages. And at the time, it was grouped with a couple other books that were speculating that the stock market might hit up to 30,000. And so we were kind of classified as these crazy kind of optimists about what would happen. And so we said, it is possible that the Dow could hit 30,000. And so what happened? By 2020, it hit 30,000. Again, almost seemed like preposterous in the mid-90s. So I'm going to swing this thing around today. So I got a little bit of a decent track record here. And why? Because there's a couple developments that basically affect your field, are part of your field, which I'm going to remind you of here, and a field that essentially I'm also part of here now too. One is I'm going to talk about a little sci-fi here. For those of you that are, in fact, a lot of people that think about the future are into sci-fi. But anyhow, this is the Foundation series. One of the most famous kind of sci-fi trilogies of all time is the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. And Apple TV tried to kick it off. First time ever anyone tried to visually capture this. I don't know if you watched this. It was an interesting first season. I think they're coming back with the second season now. This is a character in there, so not Isaac himself. But what I want to just say about this, the premise of the story is fascinating, and it's because Isaac Asimov wrote these in the 50s, at the time where computers, we had just invented mainframe computers, the computer age had really just begun, and the second thing was you could say the information age had just begun. And he speculated through this series, what happens if you essentially have so much information, essentially all information is accessible, and ultimately have tools, i.e. computers and others, to actually figure out from that data to predict the future. And in this story, this character essentially cracks the way to predict the future, and that sets off the whole plot around the whole thing, which I won't give away. But the interesting thing about this is since basically Asimov's time, we've actually watched, particularly with the digitization of data, an insane amount of collection of data. So we're now, everyone kind of is familiar, at least with the terabyte level of stuff. We're starting to get into this level of exabytes and zettabytes. So just remember those two bottom things. Maybe a lot of you this is obvious, but a lot of people, it's like exabytes and zettabytes. Okay, just keep adding zeros. Well, if you go from and you guys are the data science crew guy, right? If you go from the time humans started putting information on clay tablets, basically 10,000 years ago, 8,000 BC, all the way to the beginning of this century, 2003, all humans have put together about 5 exabytes of data. That's that one notch up, with all the zeros. We are now cranking about 5 exabytes every 2 days. And the world's information is doubling every 2 years. And that is because everything is now being captured as digital. Everybody's phone, everybody's everything, and everything's being digitized. This wasn't the case, but when I was in Wired in the 90s, I think 7%, in 1990, I think 7% of all the world's information was digital. It's now about, you can start saying it's 100%. And so we're watching here, we're about 60 zettabytes, that's that lower rung, of data in 2020. By 2025, we're looking to hit, what is it here, 175 zettabytes is what we're shooting for here. Or tracking towards, I should say, not shooting for. So the thing is, we are getting, there's an insane amount of data out there, right? Now, the second side of this is essentially the tools to understand that data. And when I say tools, there's the AI stuff, which we're going to chat about a little bit. But I would say the tools in terms of strategic foresight and other ways of doing this. And here is Stuart Brand, who again was one of the other co-founders of GBN. He's a mentor of mine. I work closely with Stuart at GBN. He also is the founder of the Long Now Foundation, which if you don't know about it, is a very useful kind of collection of long-term thinkers. He's an amazing guy. There's a new biography about him, which is well worth reading. There's a new documentary out about him. If you don't know him, he's a really interesting character. It has a huge influence on Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs was lionized the guy, and a lot of the kind of this generation also thinks of him as a kind of a lot of their inspiration. Anyhow, Stuart, I just put him out here just because there's been a bunch of new tools on this stuff. One of them has been an understanding, which, might be old hat to some of you folks, but this idea of we understand how all new technologies go through this technology adoption curve, right? And so all successful ones. Not every technology is successful. Anyhow, it goes through this thing. But here's the thing that's been interesting. We're getting better and better at understanding the tipping points. When does that tipping point happen? And the reason that's so important here is you can, in the mid-90s, see those tipping points and say, hey, this is going to happen in the next 25 years, which played out. We're hitting all these tipping points now, which I'm going to lay out here in a second here. The thing about tipping points, which is interesting, is up until they tip, people think, oh, yeah, that's never going to work. It's never work. Oh, it's clunky. It doesn't happen. All of a sudden it tips and everyone goes, oh, my God, it's awesome. It's great. And the whole thing goes crazy. Here's the other thing about it. It has to do with paradigm shifts. Is people will always hang on to the old paradigm of the old technology or the old paradigm saying, oh, you know, I like that, I know it, it's good for me. They'll see a new technology or a new approach, and they'll say, well, that's interesting, but it's not worth shifting. You'll get enough people will add to that and think, oh my God, this is awesome. And then all of a sudden, boom, the whole thing just goes. We see this again and again and again with technologies and that tipping point. We also see it in social trends, basically. You see the same thing. You can go, okay, this is how women are treated in the workplace, and all of a sudden you'll get this Me Too thing, and all of a sudden completely changes what the norm is overnight, basically. And the people who are doing it, you know, are ostracized. The people who doubt, you know, it's not even a debate after that. Anyhow, it's a fascinating thing in terms of future thinking. The other thing is there are some things, critical uncertainties, and you guys are all about this uncertainties thing. You know, not everything always goes the right way. I'm going to make a couple calls here that ones I do think, and we'll do some reference to other stuff here in a minute. Now, one set of inexorables here is climate change, and I think just to step back, I just want to just drill home some of these facts that, you know, again, you might be aware of, but I think it just is really, you got to just stare them down a second here to understand how profoundly this is going to change the next 25 years. One is the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, which is trapping the heat. Essentially, were totally stable since the time of Jesus Christ, right? You know, at zero, until the Industrial Revolution, and then they just went up. And so the debate, it's not really a debate at this stage. There was, you know, 20 years ago, people were debating that. But basically, it's going up. Now, the thing is, that's a bad direction, but it's even worse than we think. If you go back to all the time that human beings have been on the Earth, and that's essentially our species, Homo sapiens, arrived about 250,000 years ago, and that's about halfway through that thing. Those ups and downs, by the way, are ice ages, where the carbon naturally kind of goes up and down, between ice ages and melting and that kind of stuff. And that's that Industrial Revolution thing, boom, it's gone through the roof. So human beings have never been anywhere close to a planet this warm. Now, it can get a lot worse and go up to the point where it's, you know, dinosaurs are running around, giant lizards are running, and there's not, you know, a speck of snow on the planet. And, you know, mammals, you know, you can only survive if you're the size of chipmunks or something. That's what it was, you know, 160 million years ago. But basically, we're not going to go that high. But basically, the point is, that's a bad direction to go, right? So what you're watching here is also different regions have contributed to this over time. And it is true that developing countries, China and India and that, are putting more in now. But over time, essentially, the developed world in the West and the United States and Europe have actually created the most damage here. But what's interesting is the flatlining of the United States and Europe, because we actually know how to grow without which being much more efficient and much less kind of, you know, release of carbon. And again, there's carbon capture and all kinds of stuff that I know the oil companies are working on too. So there are ways to solve this. And so what the debate now is, again, the whole COP difficulty and all that kind of stuff, is we're all trying to figure out how do we crest that curve and bring it down and do it in a way that really does turn the corner on this. And, you know, you're hearing hysterical talks about it, but you're also watching people get very serious about this. Now this, if you don't really stare this thing down and think about it, you cannot understand the next 25 years. Whether you like it or not, or whether your industry, whatever, wants to see this or not, it's going to happen. And it's going to happen for a bunch of reasons. We're going to go over this. Now, the good news here is that these technologies are hitting these tipping points right in time, which is kind of wild. And so you could actually have debated in 2010, you know, will we ever see solar energy kind of get to the point where it's competitive to coal or something? And that, you know, that was a good debate. That debate's over. Basically, that thing is gone. And as you know, the whole coal industry is collapsing. You know, I mean, it's holding and whatever, but I'm saying no one's investing in the future of coal energy, right? And meanwhile, you're watching these costs of solar just come, boom, down the way they are to the point where they are really getting increasingly cheaper, actually, than, particularly in California and different places, and here in Texas, weirdly. They got a ton of solar and wind going here because it's cheaper than doing the kind of carbon. And so you've watched essentially globally, solar's just taken off. The same kind of hockey stick we saw at digital. It's going exponential. If you take the last 20 years, that's exponential. You're watching solar is hitting this exponential growth for different reasons, but essentially it's the scaling phenomena is getting to growth like that. It is credible now to think by 2035 the United States could be 100% onto clean energy in electricity. That was the red one was essentially a projection before this last big thing went through Congress, which was they call it the Inflation Reduction Act, but it essentially was a climate bill that essentially has a $370 billion going into stimulating that environment. So we actually do think we can hit it. And that's just, okay, that's the kind of foundational thing. Now, that doesn't mean carbon's going to go away and all. There's all kinds of stuff that's going to transition. But I'll just say, that's a remarkable thing that's happening, and it's happening globally. This is even more remarkable, and it'll just show you how fast things can go, electric mobility. Because again, if you went back to 2010 and said, hey, do you think electric cars will happen by the 2020s? Everyone would think, yeah, right. They've been talking about that forever. That thing is also, that's a debate that's over. It was Elon and Tesla blew that thing open and completely blew apart the entire basically legacy auto industry. And now every single company on the planet is doing electric now. And why? Because the cost of lithium-ion batteries came dramatically down in that decade, 2010. Boom, that's the numbers. There is another discussion here that could go as much as 3 to 5 times cheaper. They're thinking in the United States within the next 1 or 2 years, buying an electric car will be cheaper than internal combustion. Basically, it's already the case in China. There's all kinds of places. It's like people are going to say, it's cheaper. Why would I get the more expensive one, right? And so you're starting to watch, essentially, them starting to scale. So global inventory is about 10% of all new car sales now globally are electric. In the United States, which is frankly a laggard in this, it's hit 5%. Now, why is 5% of new cars? That's interesting. Why? Because 5% happens to be where that tipping point comes in other technologies a lot. Once a new technology hits about 5% of the market, enough people get exposed to it, and it's a better technology or has economic advantages, basically it takes off. And so what we're looking here, and again, is we're probably looking at right now, this is not projection, but in China and Europe are all about 20% of new cars are now basically electric vehicles. We're below that. But in the next 40 years, up to 2040, this is a reasonable projection, actually, of what they think is going to happen. This is, again, before we got the stimulus of the Inflation Reduction Act. But anyhow, point is, this is happening globally. And so we're watching a throttling back of internal combustion. You're going to see a building up of this. Now, again, you can disagree with this, or maybe your business is rooted in this. And I don't know. I'm just trying to lay out, what I think is happening. And believe me, I've been doing talks like this to the auto industry now, because they're all like, they're on board now. They're not about, hey, we really like our internal combustion, we're going to fight it. No, they're like, okay, how do I make money in this new world? Now, an economic long boom. If you take all three of those technologies, and you basically think about the implications, economic booms happen when you have new technologies, create new industries, create new growth, new wealth, new jobs, new everything, right? We got 3 of them. We got a triple-barreled long boom going on here. The one I talked about, my book called The Long Boom, was on one fundamentally new technology, which was digital, the computers and the internet. They're the same kind of technology, but anyhow, we got 3 of them. And so we're going to talk here about these different groups. I just talked about the energy WUDs, which are going to create a boom. There's going to be an unbelievable amount of money made in that world. Basically, there's another one in the next stage of AI, or basically information technology, and then there's this in the biotech world. And so I'm going to do this quickly, and we're moving fast here, but I want to just keep touching base on things that you can discuss for the next, couple days if you want. Here's the one that you basically are underestimating probably. Universal connectivity. See all those little things that's supposed to simulate. Right now, we have, and basically another Elon Musk thing, Starlink, among others, there's other competitors. Basically, we have satellites now that are blanketing the Earth and basically going to deliver cheap, high bandwidth connections to every single foot of the planet. In fact, right now, Ukraine is on the internet because of Starlink, which is essentially a satellite system, right? So what you're going to see here is another 3 billion people come onto the internet. Because what people forget is the blue, by the way, is who's on the internet, which is big. The red is who's not on the internet. People don't realize this in the West. Half of Asia is not on the internet. 2/3 of Africa and the Middle East, they're not on the internet. I mean, not even like on a cell phone. I mean, nobody. 40% of Latin America, they're all going to come on the internet, basically, in the next 3 years. So if you're an online business and you basically want to sell to another 3 billion people, or you want to basically use workers, another 3 billion workers, it's happening. That's inevitable. That's just happening. The other thing you got to remember is the rest of the digital revolution is playing out is the business world has basically been digitized, you could say, particularly consumer business. But essentially, we're still watching education, healthcare, government, a lot of sectors of the human, economy in the broadest sense, is still going through this digital transformation. So those are just boring old things that we're still doing that are going to have a big impact. But here's the big one: is basically this AI thing, ubiquitous AI, and I don't know to what extent you've done this, but literally last night, I basically went into ChatGPT at the OpenAI project, which again, anyone can do for free. You can go to Bing, you can go to a bunch of ways you can do this. If you haven't done it, you should absolutely do this. Because it's actually, if you have not interacted with this essentially now OpenAI, it is really something. I mean, because you're dealing with an entity, an intelligent entity that is not human, but it is really something different. It's not, and I just asked that. I said, hey, I'm going to be, literally, there's my question. What would you say if I was giving a keynote speech to the Society of Decision Professionals? Okay, well, it's an honor to be speaking. And just return this in 30 seconds, by the way. And you should scan down through it. It's actually, it's solid. It's not as good as me, I'm telling you. But basically, the point is, it was one question, because normally what you have to do is you have to play with it. You kind of go back and forth, say, okay, it's not a bad start, but what about now? How would you talk about AI's impact? But anyhow, it just keeps going, right? And everyone who's getting a peek at this it's blowing their minds, basically. And they're starting to think, oh my God, how is that going to affect my industry? And I'm not going to go into specifics on what you guys are, but I will tell you how people make decisions are absolutely going to use this tool from now on. And the earlier you get your head wrapped around that, the better it's going to be off for you folks. And don't freak out. There's going to be plenty of room for humans to kind of be above that and kind of tease it out and all the different ways they're going to put it in context and explain it and all kinds of things, implement it. But it's just a tool that's just quite mind-boggling. Now, one of the things that's going to happen here is these are prices essentially since the turn of the century here. And one thing you see here is things that involve human labor have gone up in cost, and things that pretty much don't or are automated by technology are cheaper, if not, or the same. Even cars are the same price, given inflation adjusted kind of things. Everything else has to do with labor. Why? Basically, college and education is all about labor, and it hasn't changed or used technology updates since medieval times. Frankly, it's the same professor sitting there that happened in Oxford in 1200. And so it's super expensive. I'm telling you, anything that and why? Because it's a human brain. The machine couldn't do it. A machine can screw hubcaps on, and so that's been fully layered into cars. But it can't teach economics 101 until now. Actually, now I'm not saying humans will go away. What I'm trying to say is what is now happening is all these things that we thought couldn't be applied technology to it is now going to open up. And so you'll still have professors and you'll still have all these things that they'll mentor and guide and socialize and all kinds of stuff with young people. But teaching the basics or looking over the homework or grading a paper or something, a lot of that could actually be pushed into technology, which will bring these costs down, which we're going to get to in a minute here. Second thing is, what is this going to do? It's going to accelerate innovation. And you guys are in decision makers, but so you're going to have to get faster at making decisions. Because here's I'll give you one example of this, which is another mind blower. Basically, this decade, AI is going to make natural language translation nuanced and immediate, basically, in real time. And this is going to really be wild, because up until now, that's how many are native English speakers. Everyone in this room seems, well, not everyone, but many people here are native English speakers. It's not even 500 million people in an 8 billion, there's 8 billion people on the planet. 500 million of them speak English naturally. Everybody else basically has to learn English to play the game of business language or science language or whatever it is. It's all English, right? If you have essentially AI able to simultaneously over video or even with an earbud, you're walking down the streets of Bombay, you can interact with anybody, basically, and that person who's uneducated or just a street vendor can actually understand what you're saying fluently and with nuance. That just blows open, essentially, cross-fertilization of ideas and access to information. And that essentially is what innovation is about, is essentially cross-fertilizing perspectives, different fields, different things, different hits on things. This is why everyone talks about diversity of perspectives is a good thing. Anyhow, it is. I mean, that's what innovation is, basically, at its core. And so what you're going to basically see is an explosion of innovation. This is, if we didn't, we got enough time, I guess, because we got so much time here with you folks. But anyhow, this is one thing I've used this before, and I threw it in here just because it's interesting. Brian Eno, who's a great musician, producer of musicians, a British musician. He also works with The Long Now, Stuart Brand's thing. And he had written a book 25 years ago. And to reissue the book as a kind of as a re-edition 25 years later, he had The Long Now, of which I was involved with and participating in, come up with words that didn't exist 25 years ago that essentially had some reflection out on innovation, right? And this is just a fraction of them, by the way. But what's an Airbnb? If you would have said 25 years ago, what's an Airbnb? What's alt-right? What's alternative facts? What's Amazon? What's FOMO? What's, incel? What's women's studies? What's woke? What's woke? I mean, anyhow, the point is there's a million things. And what I just want to remind you is the next 25 years, you can't predict all these things either. It's going to be an explosion of these things, right? As you take the human brains, take these tools, they're going to go nuts with ideas. And so my kind of thing I keep reminding people who are always depressed about the future is like humans are extremely good problem solvers, and we are really getting good at progress. And so I'm just telling you, you think, oh, how will we ever solve climate change? Oh, how will we ever deal with this or that? I mean, it's like just point the new North Star to these bunch of human beings. They're going to and incentivize them, and they're going to figure it out. So anyhow, this is more the way to think about the future. Quick shift now to bio, and I know there's a lot of pharma people here, but this is another thing that I think people outside the field do not understand how fast this is moving. Let me give you this one. It costs $3 billion and took 15 years to crack the first human genome, which happened right after the turn of the century here, right? It is now, in the course of 20 years, it got it down to $1,000 to do an entire person. Anyone here could get their entire genome sequenced for $1,000. It's now going to be about $100. There are startups that I literally know in Berkeley that are essentially getting it to $100. So basically, everybody on the planet could basically have their genome sequenced. This is faster, by the way, than the doubling phenomena or the drops in cost of Moore's law around computing by half. It's twice as fast. The breakthroughs have been so amazing on this. So dirt cheap sequencing of anything, not just humans, but anybody. The second thing, which is just mind-blowing, and you hear this, but you've got to think it through a second here, is we essentially now know how to cheaply and easily edit anything genetically. And that happened about 2013, 2014 with this CRISPR breakthrough, which the Dudna, basically, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, basically got the Nobel Prize in it, basically. But anyhow, one of the reasons I'm putting this slide up is it happened about in the early part of that decade, but essentially once pharma and basically biotech and VCs kind of understood this, they're like, boom, it started to go crazy. And with the mRNA breakthrough, which saved our asses, that was all about genetic understanding. That was all about, hey, how do we fake out the kind of virus about this or that? Anyhow, all this stuff's just starting to take off. So tons of money going in. Things are booming. This brings up a piece that affects this petrochemical industry, for example, is essentially what they call synthetic biology. So now we understand the genome. We understand how to edit it cheaply. We also understand just all biological processes better and better and better, which is how do cells work and how do proteins develop and what proteins do what. And anyhow, we're just getting this understanding that's going to allow us to basically biologically engineer. Not just genetically, that'll be a big part of it, but biologically engineer things in ways that we used to just engineer physical things. So for example, you could genetically engineer or biologically engineer an alternative to plastic that could cover essentially food, or put water in a bottle and when exposed to kind of salt water after banging around an ocean for 2 weeks would essentially biodegrade and things like that. I mean, they're starting to think now, a lot of startups are now starting to think, if we just genetically, anyhow, there's a bunch of ways to do this. I'm just kind of planting the seed here that essentially things that we used to think about materials differently, production differently, in a different approach to essentially engineering living things. And I'll give you one of them here, which has to do with meat, cultured meat. So we know how to take a cell from a cow or a pig or a fish, whatever it is, and then take it out. You don't have to kill the cow or anything. You put that cell in a vat. You give it the same amino acids and water and all kinds of stuff that the cow does by roaming around for 3 years of its life, chewing grass and eating things. Anyhow, you essentially much more efficiently do it, and you can grow essentially meat. It's called cultured meat. People call it different things. But basically, that's cultured, essentially meat. Well, one of the reasons this is being driven is that beef, as a meat protein source, is extremely bad, bad on the environment, basically. You can see here the numbers. Poultry and chicken less so. But basically, this is and everybody in the world wants to eat meat, as they get more wealth here and things like that. And so what they're thinking is actually, you can imagine this cultured meat taking a bigger and bigger slice of what's happening. This is projected out to 2040. And the reason I'm kind of saying this is it's not your great steak is going to go away, but McDonald's hamburgers all over the world are going to be cultured meat, right? And this will actually help on this larger problem of how we're going to deal with the sustainable economy. Again, this is how I'm saying, once you set these new North Stars out of what the new plan is and what we have to work on, everybody starts moving in a million directions. This is one of them. Now, I'm going to do fast here, give it how much time we got, although we're in good shape here. I want to plant the seed that people aren't really thinking about, but it's starting to surface in politics, weirdly, in both sides of, kind of the politics, about abundance. So the object of any society should be, we want an abundant society where everyone has enough, can kind of live well, thrive. That's the idea of any society, right? That's always been the idea. And up until now, we've had a scarcity mentality that, some people can do fine, but not others. And it's always cutting the pie has always been the problem. But it starts to make you think differently with these technologies. Is it possible that you could start to think about a different way to make things more abundant by making them a lot cheaper? So I'm just going to throw out a couple here fast, just to shift you. Housing. Every single basically city in the world, and I'm coming from one that's one of the worst in the world right now, but every place housing is going through the roof, affordable housing is difficult, and many people are getting problems with homeless, right? There's another abundant education we won't get into, but I want to just say a housing thing. Here's how AI might affect this in an interesting way, because I do think we're also going to see autonomous vehicles in the next 25 years. This AI thing is happening. Basically, in San Francisco right now, you can actually call a Cruise, essentially, which GM bought. Essentially, you can get a taxi now with no driver. You can't do it in rush hour and a few different constraints, but essentially it's happening. It's happening in LA, it's happening in Phoenix. Anyhow, the point is this is going to happen in the next 25 years, right? How widespread? It depends. But if this essentially takes off and we have shared electric vehicles, as opposed to individual car ownership, basically a third of all cities in the world are devoted to parking spaces, basically of these individual cars, where, it's your driveway, it's the parking lot at work, it's the parking lot at the grocery store, it's the parking lot, whatever, it's the side of the streets. Everybody needs to park their individual car. If you actually, because the millennials are into this, share a shared, and you just call up, hey, I need the van today for the kids. Comes up, you can actually drive the kids to the soccer if you want, but anyhow, you didn't have to have your own van. It's like, oh, you know what, I want to take the SUV to the mountains, boom, it'll come. Anyhow, this is something that you can imagine, rethink, and they're starting to think this a little bit more. What could that do to housing? Now, this is not inevitable, but this is a possible one, which could actually you got a third of all cities back, boom, you can basically do all kinds of things around housing and all kinds of things that we didn't know. Anyhow, I'm just throwing out ideas. These are not for sure. Energy. And again, this is an energy crude, but I will say this is interesting. Abundant energy. This is a weird thing to think about. But it's possible. I'm not going to get into the abundant water thing here just because we got time. But here's an example. This is, by the way, this is my little back office I built, basically designed and built. That's my solar on my roof. I got a battery on the side and I got an electric car, full disclosure. But I'll tell you this, because once my system's installed now, I don't care about energy. It's solar. I can basically run my car, it's off the sun. I can leave the lights on, I don't care. It's not affecting the environment. It's not affecting my energy bill. I'm off the grid. I can totally use it, whatever. The point is, it changes your attitude towards energy. Energy is cheap, it's easy, it's there, it's free. And it starts to make people think. And this is just the conventional way as we kind of scale up super cheap kind of solar and things like that. The other way, though, is this is a crazy thing for you people to think about the future. Is we just had a breakthrough in November in basically the Berkeley labs, kind of right off where I live, the national labs, where we essentially have crossed the threshold to getting more energy out of a nuclear fusion kind of example. Nuclear fission is when you essentially break apart an atom and release energy. That's the nuclear industry as we know it now. It does create waste. It creates kind of difficulties around safety and things like that, and so it's been stagnated. I do think that's going to be improved, and we're basically going to go with nuclear fission for a while too. But here's the thing that's happened. If you take essentially two atoms and you fuse them, you essentially create much more energy, no waste, and weirdly it's safer because you can just, for other reasons I won't go into. The point is, this is what the sun does, this is what basically all stars do. This is the holy grail of energy. It's always taken too much energy in our experiments up until now to fuse them, because then the energy you got out, it wasn't enough to compensate for the energy you put in. We have now finally overcompensated. We're getting more energy out of these things than not, and there are now basically a bunch of startups now in Bay Area, and again, could be other places too that I don't know about, but basically are now starting to think we could possibly commercialize fusion energy. It's going to take another decade or two, and it's not inevitable, but it is possible now in ways that it had been science fiction before. Again, could have a huge kind of impact on our thoughts of energy. And again, a lot of petrochemical. I would just instead of calling yourself an oil company or a petrochemical company, I would call yourself an energy company, because honestly, energy is going to be a fascinating and amazing place the next bit here. Final little thing here is abundance around healthcare. Now, so healthcare is super expensive. Everyone screams bloody murder. It's just insane, particularly in this country. But here's the thing. If you basically understand the genetic makeup of all human beings, it's super easy to get it, it's $100, and you actually understand the biological understanding of how disease happens and all this kind of stuff, which we're learning every week better and better and better, it's not out of the question to think we could actually front-load healthcare in ways that dramatically drop the cost of this kind of crazy after the end, and you've got this crazy heart attacks and all the stuff that's happening, and you're on life support and all that stuff. That's where the costs come, right? But essentially, you can imagine, and also AI monitoring you 24/7. Again, cheap, kind of like AI coming back at you and telling you what to do. Anyhow, there's a whole thing around that, and that could actually bring down costs. So things that we thought were never going to happen, or it's like, oh, it'll always be expensive, it could actually be different. So I just want to have you think about that. Now, we're going to take just a pause here. And they did tell me I could go a little bit. Originally, we're shooting for 20 minutes of conversation, but they had 30 they were going to do, and I was going to take a little bit extra time here to both because I want to talk about the next phase here. Get into a little trickier thing, politics and some global stuff, because I think it's important here. If you're thinking about the future, you got to think this through a little bit, and. This always gets a little touchy when you talk about this, but less touchy because I think if you really want to understand the next 25 years, you have to understand how will politics play out, not just in America, but also in the West. And I think there's things that are going to really be some surprises here. And you don't have to necessarily believe me 100%, but let me lay out the case here why I think this is happening. And I'm going to touch on a few things globally, and then we could basically have this conversation. The first thing you really got to understand is America is going through an unbelievable generational shift here. Basically, this is essentially the American population in the year 2020. And essentially that, in between those things, is essentially the guts of the economy. Your consumers, your workers, that's what's happening. Now, the first thing you look at that is you say, the baby boom is half retired. A lot of them hang a little bit longer and stuff. But anyhow, point being, in general, retired. And they're dying off. People, you got to just stare that number down. These are real numbers, right? So that's 2020, right? The other thing to look at is their kids plus a lot of immigrants, too, that came in the last boom, basically is the biggest generation in American history by far, and they're all the guts of the economy right now, right? So if you just push this out to 2030, then you got Gen Z coming in there. Gen Z is very aligned with the millennials in terms of their concern about climate change or diversity and issues like that. And the baby boomers are all retired and essentially continuing down that slope. And so you start thinking, okay, well, whatever those guys, those millennials and Gen Z want, is now going to start happening in politics. Not just the culture. The culture has already shifted. Why is corporate America going nutty about climate change and diversity? Why is it being accused of being woke and stuff from different points? It's because they know that's where their business is and that's what their workers want. And they're not going to cater to the boomers who aren't buying anything. Or working. So the point is, this has shifted culturally. It hasn't hit politically yet. It will. And basically, if you just play it out to 2040, it's just that game. It's the only game in town. You play it out to 2050, which I'm just saying is the end of my thing here. And we don't know what their kids will be like. But anyhow, the point is it's a different world. And here's the other thing that people kind of know, but you got to see the numbers of this. New majorities. Those two generations, the millennials and the Gen Zers, are basically 50-50 people of color at white people. This is the first time in American history we've even come close to that. The boomers were 80% white. They didn't really, and the only other race they had was African American. There was no other races in the baby boom. But this is a total mashup of all over. Why is it? It's because we've gone through a second great immigration boom in the United States. The first one is the late 19th century, early 20th, throttled back at the war. And then it opened up again, starting in the 80s, frankly, with Ronald Reagan and others. Boom, blew open that way again. So we got two different waves of immigration going through. Now we're in a second wave. And so what's happened now is a percentage of white people, this is 2020, as people of color percentage go up, the other percentage goes down. And we're on track to about 2045 to be whites as a minority in this country. This, by the way, happened in California 15 years ago. Right now, I think California is about 35% white. Awesome place to live. It's not changed. It doesn't change the game crazy. I mean, it's like the idea that, some people are worried about that and all. It's like, fine. But basically, the point is this is happening. This is not illegal immigration, by the way. This is just playing the numbers out, which is good. So I'm just saying is we should remind ourselves that American history is filled with essentially a pendulum swing between two kinds of political eras. And we've watched this, and they go between conservative and I would say progressive. Some people called it liberal for one piece. But in all of American history, think of it as progressive. That's how political scientists talk about it. Look at the words, conserve, progress. I mean, they're kind of baked in. What is kind of those different eras about? And both are positive. Sometimes you need to renew and conserve and go back to the principles, and sometimes you need to kind of reinvent and go forward and try something new. So what's happened in American history is we go that way. Sometimes it holds for like a 40-year period. Sometimes you're in these transitions where nothing gets done, which is, I would argue, what happened last 10 years. And at a national level, and then other times you go into progressive eras. So what I'm basically trying to tell you is the last time we saw a progressive era was what happened after World War II. And it was the great boom of World War II, it was the New Deal, it was the Great Society, it was all that kind of stuff that we associate with that. It was a great time, we built the suburbs, everyone had jobs, GI Bill, everything was crazy. I mean, the world was, we look back on the great boom of that. I would say what we've just come out of, and again, I don't know where your own politics are, but I'm just trying to tell you, I think what we saw, we've just come out of a conservative era. But Trump was kind of the end of essentially what Reagan started. And that was essentially known as a conservative era. And there's a lot of positive things about it. Entrepreneurial, we created this, all this stuff I said was amazing. It's a lot of good things in there. But I would say you should be thinking as business people or as whatever, citizens, that we're entering another one of those. Stronger government, more concerned with spreading wealth, a lot of stuff around that. And so that's something. And I will say this kind of, again, gets me in trouble, but I would just kind of say, just to make you think, because people think, oh, it's this 50-50 country, and it's all got to be the same, and it will never get anything done. This is, I think, a misunderstanding of what's happening here. Republicans, or generally conservatives, have lost the last 7 of the last 8 presidential elections to the popular vote. They've won it one time, the one time the red states, or in this case, George Bush, his second election, he did win the popular vote. And that was the high water mark, and that was the, right there you can see the Electoral College. This was kind of Biden, where you see that California West Coast politics is now going through the Southwest. Even the Deep South is starting to kind of buckle there. This is where I would argue, this is kind of more the norm of where the country's going, and I would even say push this out. It's possible, and again, I don't know your own politics, but I think these are starting to be more battlegrounds, more than you think. And I think because a lot of millennials are moving off the coast, so they're kind of coming to the cheaper houses of Austin, and kind of, you're watching this kind of shifting of the demographics of the country basically happening. All it takes is one of those big states to flip, and essentially presidential politics is a lock. And so I would just say, again, do not count on essentially the good old politics of the last 40 years on this. I think we're going to see something different. Anyhow, boom, and I'm going to shift now out of politics. We're going to argue at the bar tonight or whatever. But I think it's worth talking about. And I'm going to finish here with some global stuff. Because you can't solve climate change, you can't kind of do these things, and we're living in a globalized world here. So one of the things I want to just point out is besides this digital revolution, there was this globalization phenomenon. It was an extraordinary thing happened in the last 40 years. One is, if you take all of, these are exports as a percentage of world growth, it exploded in 1980 and boom. This was the long boom in exports. This is the long boom in human beings traveling around the planet. Basically, when I was a college kid, I was traveling around Europe and stuff, but there were very few people on the planet. We're moving to even seeing other countries. And now essentially it's 1.5 billion before the pandemic here. Basically humans are moving, things are moving, humans are going. Per capita kind of growth. China and East Asia, here's the deal. Yeah, there was tough times for some sectors of the American economy, working class. But it's from a global point of view, this has been an awesome thing. This last 25 years was a boom for the rest of the world in a way that was very, very positive for many people. If you think about just humans on the planet, there was a lot of growth. Basically, if you took people living in extreme poverty, basically over 40% of the world in 1980 was living on less than $2 a day. Boom, that's under 10% now. It's about 8%. A lot of that's because China took 800 million peasants living on less than $2 a day and moved them into cities, into the productive economy. Why did China boom, and why did all those things be so cheap? It's because if you've been living on $2 a day and you move in a city and you got a factory job, you will work for nothing, basically, but better than $2. And anyhow, that thing's been going. And now the things like illiteracy and things like that are also coming down. So basically, the world has actually been moving in a great direction. So just to kind of finish here, I want to say what's going forward here. We already talked about climate change, but I want to just say global capital is shifting. So actually this isn't fully updated, but last year 1.2 trillion, the new numbers I have to push in here, $1.2 trillion went into essentially clean energy and that stuff, but also the electric car. The car industry took in $350 billion in global capital. So global capital is starting to shift, and you're starting to see the money get up to serious kind of money. China, 25 years ago, they were just fledgling. Now they're a superpower, for better or worse. This is interesting. Just look at what China did. They essentially this is high-speed electric trains. They basically have laid 37,000 kilometers of high-speed train. America doesn't have any high-speed trains. We're trying to get the first one from San Francisco to LA. It's getting shut down by NIMBYs and all kinds of stuff. Essentially, they've gotten 18,000 miles, basically, they've laid in that period. Now, in that kind of uncertainty, I would say China is not going to be the same booming country. It's probably going to struggle. China is now getting more authoritarian with Xi, and essentially we're watching nationalism go up. We could be moving towards some kind of new Cold War, which is a bummer. One of the reasons that this is being driven is the Chinese population, is the red over there. That's the other one is India, which we could talk about later. But they don't have enough workers. And so their economy is heading towards a disaster. And they don't know what to do about it. And when you do that kind of stuff, you do crazy stuff abroad or all kinds of stuff. And you can't bring in immigration. There's 1.4 billion people there. So anyhow, That's something to think about, changing your decision making. Total urbanization, just want to tell you, put you in the mind here, think globally. For the first time in human history, more people lived in cities than rural was in 2010. That is essentially going to dwarf out by 2050. We're expecting about 70%, if not 80%, of the world will essentially be in cities, which is, again, refashion these cities, recreate these cities, all kinds of things. Middle-class majorities. For those of you who work abroad, and as I do a lot, this is a common thing in Asia particularly. What is a middle class in the world context? It's someone who has an air conditioner, who has a refrigerator, and has an electric scooter, and has enough money to survive if they get thrown out of work a little bit. And maybe also education for their kids. That's a global middle class. That's not an American middle class, whatever. We're rich in that level. If you take that standard, essentially this is the world in 2020. Essentially was half the world was that middle class or richer. This is, again, even our poor are essentially in the rich there. And the vulnerable is less than $10 a day, and the poor are less than $2 a day. We are expecting to add about 1.7 billion more people into that global middle class, drop these other categories, boost the rich, but it's not going to be a huge. But anyhow, the point is the world is essentially going to bring out enough decent kind of jobs for people to kind of live that way. And the final thing I would say is something that in the West has been a struggle and an interesting thing, but it blazed the trail globally, and it also is going to solve our population problems, because people get all worried about, oh my God, we're going to have too many people on the planet. Well, it looks like we're going to top out at about 10 billion people. We're at 8 now. But why is that? Is because basically in the developed countries, women, when they get educated, when they basically, particularly when get equal access to jobs and opportunities, essentially they have less kids. And this has been happening, it's going all over the world now. And in fact, even in less developed countries like Africa and stuff, this has been happening. Those numbers, the solid numbers, are facts. But basically the projections are out. So we are looking pretty well that we're going to essentially top out at a comfortable 10 billion. We can solve that without blowing off the lid of the planet. That's a thing. If anything, we're going to be worried about there's not going to be enough people to run the economy, but that's a separate story. And the final thing here is I'm going to wrap up here to give us some time to talk in a minute here. I just want to drill down to you. I've been laying out a lot of stuff. You don't have to believe 100% of it. But one thing you should see is we are living in an historic moment, folks. That this is not a normal time in the planet or in the life of the history of the country. Most people here are Americans. I will tell you there's this uncanny thing. Every 40 years in American history, it's a crazy thing. We watch essentially a transformation or a reinvention. Now, without going too much into history, we don't have the time to do that. We could do that. But let's just, people remember, okay, 1860, Civil War. We created a whole different society out of that. All kinds of stuff. Transcontinental Railroad, Homestead Act. 2000, the progressive era, boom, Teddy Roosevelt and later Wilson, boom, a whole kind of way we reworked urban living. Basically coming off the great, Depression, World War II, the whole thing that started out in the 40s, the great boom after that. Reagan, kind of shifted the whole politics more in a conservative way. By the way, there's been other shifts to conservative there. Basically kind of did it in a different direction. I'm saying we're entering another one here. I don't know who that person is. It's not the current set leader right now. It's not Biden, for example. But I would say something's going to happen in this next 40 years here that is essentially going to mark essentially a similar thing, I would argue. And so we're in essentially a time of what we call grand strategy. Big shifts are happening. And so I think one of the big shifts that's happening that I would finally leave you with is this idea of a potential Cold War. Now, I was a foreign correspondent in Asia. I basically was in China after Tiananmen Square. I mean, I know China, and I've been around there a lot. I was one that thought it would just keep liberalizing, and we would have this kind of great kind of coexistence going forward. But I've been really, really shaken by the last 5 years or so, particularly Xi. Anyhow, there is a problem. I think what could happen is we could have real tension going, which unfortunately, but it wouldn't stop. This is essentially progress I'm talking about, but it'd be a different kind of progress. But one thing to remind you is every time we've hit those junctures in American history, 1900, we've watched a burst of essentially democracy come off of those things. And in the kind of back and forth between autocracies and democracies, that was particularly true, by the way, in 1980 with the fall of the Soviet Union and all. But I think it's like thinking there could be a global repercussions here if we restructure a global order in a new way. For better or worse, it could be tough. But anyhow, it's something we should think about, and you should think about it. I would say, unfortunately, I hope this doesn't happen. I think we should do everything to avoid this, but it's possible, and as thinking about the future, you got to think about that a little bit. So to wind up and finally do it and give us some time here to chat, I really do believe we're entering a new period of great progress. What I call this great progression. I think I've made enough of the case here. We can chat about it there. I think we are moving rapidly from a world that was, coherent and stable and we got that world to essentially a world that is emerging, not fully clear, not understanding fully how these models work, but essentially are going to be more in this direction. I think basically we are even part of an even bigger transformation that will play out through the rest of the century here. And I think people will look back and say, oh my God, this great era of digitizing and connecting all humans and eventually integrating AI, this idea of governing the planet in more cohesive planetary scale and basically working its way towards not just energy but products and all kinds of living in a more sustainable way. This is a thing that I think is possible. And I really do think that people in 50, 100, 1,000 years from now, they're going to look back in the these years in the middle of the 21st century and they're going to say, that is when the world went digital. And they're going to say, you know what? That's when the world went global, when they were really working on a planetary scale. And they're going to say, you know what? On top of that, this is when they finally figured out how to live 10 billion people on the planet and not blow the lid off the damn thing. And they'll look back and say, oh my God, here we are building off those same systems they innovated back then. It's like, wouldn't it have been an amazing time to be living and alive at the time of the Great Progression? And I'm just going to remind you you are living here, you are alive, make the most of this time. And with that, I would say, let's have a little conversation here. And if you want to get a hold of me, this is my company and this is me. So anyhow, thank you.
So now it's time for questions. And we're going to take questions from in person. We have some SDP wonderful people who are going to help us get microphones to you and virtually. And I'm not sure where I'm supposed to look for the virtual people, but you guys will let me know. So let's go.
Thank you for a fabulous, interesting presentation. I noticed that most of your graphs assume some kind of continuation and continuity going forward. And what I wonder about are potential seismic shifts. For example, do you think it's inevitable that China will absorb Taiwan? And if so, what are the impacts of that on everything that you've been showing us?
I don't have to, everyone heard that, right? Yeah, we got it? Okay, well, here's the interesting. If you read my piece, which I encourage you to do because it goes into detail and you can spread it around by all means. I do the same thing that I did with that original piece at Wired. Essentially, I went into 10 things that I think are essentially the things that worry me most. And I would put, one of them was a hot war with China. By the way, in the first story I did 25 years ago, one of the worries was a new Cold War with China. And and so that was a worry of the Cold War even back then with China. This one I would say a new hot war with China. That truly could screw up a lot of things. And so there is a a worry about that is not minor. So what I'm mostly hearing, mostly I'm the positive guy. I'm trying to get people just to even wrap their heads around the negative world and say, hey, what's possible? But I'm not dumb about that, and I've been really worried about that. I would say that is among the ones that is the most worrisome. I would also say in terms of that geopolitical stuff, I think Russia And again, a country like the United States, we have a burgeoning, carbon industries and energy industries, but we also have many ways to diversify. We have a lot of wealth to diversify and do all kinds of stuff with our economy, including, in states like, Texas here, all kinds of stuff. So there's many options as we transition in this new world. But a petrostate, and that's kind of what Putin has turned, Russia into. A petrostate that sees this kind of endgame happening and doesn't have the ways to kind of diversify the economy the way actually, frankly, the Middle East is doing or Norway's doing with their kind of economy, that thing could make them do crazy stuff. And they got nukes, and you could imagine some really crazy stuff happening from those kind of states, let alone states like, who also are petrostates that really are that's the only thing they got going for them. We got to watch that. So this transition is going to have many dangers that could disrupt it. But just kind of like I did in the first time, even with those things, I think the general through lines of what I'm talking about here we'll eventually get through. And ultimately, most of what I'm saying here, I think, could get reconfigured after a battle around Taiwan. I don't think, my own feeling is they won't do that right now. But I'm an optimist, so we'll see about that. But good point being saying there are absolutely things that could disrupt this, and don't take this for absolute granted, but I would also say you should really open your mind to this being possible too.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Matheson. I have a question about a trend towards fragmentation, and let me give you a quick example. In agriculture, there has been the buildup of an entire supply chain around, quote, healthy food, whatever that may mean. And you're seeing like split up supply chains, what used to be commodity supply chains, and there's some odd interactions. So Western preferences for anti-GMO food has slowed the adoption of golden rice in Asia. So there's a lot of interesting interaction. It's both supply chains and, of course, political and all. And I wonder if you could comment on trends towards that.
Great. You guys are you're literally lifting my 10 worries about the global economy. One of my big ones, because there's the geopolitical worries, we just brought that up. The one I'm really basically most worried about, not most worried about, there's 10 of them, is the backlash against genetic engineering and biological engineering in general. I do think that's going to be extremely difficult transition for people. People are going to react to it for religious reasons. They're going to react to it for environmental reasons. They're going to react to it so left, right. I mean, there's going to be a lot of sides that are going to have problems with this idea. And we watched with the GMO thing, you saw how essentially Europe basically put the skids or slowed down, you could say, genetic engineering of GMO foods, the first generation. I would argue, and I think a lot of people do think, that the industries in that space mishandled essentially how to use that GMO space, and that there's a different way to kind of introduce and kind of, as opposed to like figuring out a way that a corporation could sell, more in Roundup and various things. Lead with all the positive things that you could genetically engineer this food better, healthier, nutritious, deal with climate change, deal with less water, stronger against all kinds of different weather patterns and stuff like that. I think what's going to happen is a combination of both things. You're going to watch essentially a new approach to this next wave of genetic engineering, which is more tuned in to essentially how to get everyone on board or the majority on board. And I think the second thing is that we're going to watch pressures happening, particularly around climate change, but also around global competition that is essentially going to keep people more open to it. But it's going to be a difficult and interesting conversation. I do think the ethics around it and the kind of dangers around kind of biological warfare and kind of, there's going to be a lot of issues as we enter this out. But I will tell you, as human beings on the planet Earth, we're going to figure this out at some point, and I would say sooner rather than later, and certainly this century we will. But I think time has arrived, and we got to engage in that now. And but it's possible that could be delayed. That could actually be delayed later in the century or something, particularly around just blowback. And some of it's just a cultural blowback. I mean, people don't want to. They're freaked out about, okay, when we're monkeying with Mother Nature or God or however you think about it, it's like that's hard to do. So.
What about fragmentation? So people have developed.
Oh, I see different cultures.
That's an example, right? So some of your points rely on the scale and mass, but we also see fragmentation with smaller supply chains around particular preference sets, which goes the opposite direction.
Okay, so that's a good point. So I was dealing more with the larger kind of. I do think actually what are the reasons? So what he's asking there is, could different regions of the world or different localities essentially adopt different approaches to these new technologies? So you could see a whole region shut down, genetic modification of anything, but others open it up and do it. I actually do think that's a very plausible scenario. I also think in terms of essentially a global consensus and everybody's on board and we're all working together, that would be the ultimately best way to go in terms of what we're up against, I would say, in the coming decades. But I also think it's possible we're going to see kind of more localized responses and kind of competitive responses. That's why I would say technically a Cold War, I mean, look at the great Cold War essentially happened after World War II. And that led to the great boom, essentially, of America and the West in terms of rebuilding those societies. And, healthy competition could spur investment, could spur domestic cohesion, essentially, amongst population. I mean, we're killing it right now. We're screaming at each other around cultural issues. It's like, well, if you're up against a kind of a foreign kind of challenge or you're looking against somebody who is competing with you and threatening you, people kind of get over, whether or not what books you're going to have in kindergarten kind of stuff. That's a different, level of problem. So essentially, you got to say, okay. And that's kind of what happened after World War II. And so it was an interesting possibility. So even if there is a Cold War, I'm saying I think a lot of these things are going to happen. But I also do think there is a possibility of it fragmenting. Again, you guys are in this kind of scenario world. It's like, yeah, you can't predict with certainty. But I do think you can. So yes, things could happen. The general through lines, though, I would argue are going to keep happening. Somehow it's going to work. Once you humans have figured out how to do this, which they do now, we're going to monkey with it and do it. It's just, I cannot imagine humans by 2100 are not going to be total masters of genetic understanding and genetic engineering and all that. For better or worse. It could be bad. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Yes, hi. Frank Wimberley. So I have a short story for you and then a question. So my son turned 19. And so in Canada, we can go and have alcohol. So I wanted to take him to a distillery. And we couldn't remember the name. So I said to him, well, just Google it. And you'll find it out. He says, no, Dad, but my buddies and I, we don't Google anymore because it makes us dumb. So the question I've got is, what are your thoughts on the dumbing down of the population and AI and the backlash to technology, to use of technology?
Well, and again, you guys, I should have, next time I'm going to basically fire up all my reaction, my 10 worries. The first reaction, basically I did in the original 25 years ago piece, worried about the backlash against technology. And we saw it happen in the last decade, the last 5 years, in fact. Although you remember, still by 2015, 2016, the tech world was kind of the darlings of the media and everyone seemed to love them. But anyhow, there's a shift happening around that. And that was one thing where there was a worry that will people backlash. I would say this kind of generation, there is a really interesting backlash potential. My own feeling is that this is essentially one of those tools that people will not walk away from. Just like Google. I mean, your son might say that for that, but, I don't know if he's going to go through his life never doing a search engine, I mean, it's again worth remembering how crazy this, basically, Google was the first AI that people kind of experienced. But the idea that you could ask any question in the world and get back all the world's information prioritized in a second is, is just a mind-blowing thing, right? So yes, does it dumb us down about certain things? Potentially. But does it empower us with just insane kind of amazing kind of abilities? Yes. And so I think in those trade-offs, people are just going to say that's what we're going to do. We're going to be empowered by this technology. I think the AI one is going to take it another level. And that's going to be even more uncomfortable because it's not just Google giving you the top little thing from a human-made website. It's giving you its answer, having looked at all those websites and telling you what it understands as the synthesis of every one of them, or the best ones at least. And that's what's kind of a mind-blower here, is how fast this works. But I think it's going to be hard. And again, it's the classic thing with the fragmentation frame, which is when you have a world with those powers and those kinds of tools, if you choose not to use them, you kind of start to disadvantage yourself in ways that is voluntary, but could be problematic long term. So I have a feeling there's going to be a kind of a sense of like, for better or worse, we all got to kind of understand AI, potentially incorporate it, at least be aware of it, stick with it. It's possible it could shut down. People are talking about shutting down ChatGPT and all that, but it feels to me, anytime you shut down a technology, it's never worked in the world. And there's always going to be someone who can figure it out, and it's going to be your kind of global competitor. It's going to be your whatever it is. And so I would be very cautious about worried. That's probably not going to happen, in my opinion, although it's going to cross people's minds for sure. Looks like we can keep going, right? I got plenty of time here. We got till...
It's over here.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Yasser Dodd. Another, I guess, worry I have is another very clear trend that although in general, economies are growing, per capita also growing, so I completely see that we can lift a lot of people out of poverty. But there is also more and more concentration of wealth, and through that, more and more concentration of power. And with AI tools, I see the ability to manipulate populations is also growing. So there is a potential new fashion of slavery, if you will, forming through a very high concentration of power. What do you think, where's that trend going?
You guys are great. Yeah, you're the caution. Yeah, good point. So I get two ways to think about that. There is going to essentially, this technology, it's like any technology. You can use it for good and bad. And so there is going to be an approach that, for example, the Chinese are using, where they're taking it to kind of, mass surveillance, all kinds of stuff. People get worried about that in the West, but it essentially hasn't anywhere near that way. But it's got its own issues where, a few companies have all the technology and they get super empowered. What I would say is two things, is that this is where we forget that, and this is why I get into politics and things like that, and the demographic shifts and things like that, because people, I think under the current way we've been doing things for the last 40 years, I think that would be a super big worry, basically of wealth concentration, and it's going to go up, because that's what's happening. By the way, it's happening in China as well. Basically, about 30% of the entire wealth of China is in hands, was actually in the hands of the top 1%. And basically, the United States is similar. It's about 35% of the West. I mean, essentially, all of global capitalism, regardless of your political system, essentially concentrated wealth at the top. Here's the problem. What you're watching is politics can actually change that and reverse it. I mean, Xi just basically said, we're going to take out the tech titans. They literally put them in prison. Some of these guys that were sashayed around about it with all their wealth, they just like, okay, like Jack Ma and stuff like that, no one's heard from him for a year here. Now, I'm not suggesting that. But also, it can change in the West, too. You can see the politics go, hey, we're going to tax what the hell with it? It's like this tax cutting thing. Basically, in the World War II, the post-war era, basically, in the United States, the nominal tax rate for basically people, the upper 1% was about 75%, 80%, sometimes 90%. Now, the actual tax they paid was less than that because of all the different incentives to do it. But the point is, in the politics, when you're running the country, you just say, damn it, we don't care about the rich folks, and we're going to take it and we're going to move it down. Now, you could say they're going to go to other countries and whatever. That'll all happen. But essentially, that was the same discussion in post-World War II. So I'm saying the politics could shift the wealth concentration, and I expect it will. That's why I'm telling you, this next generation, by the way, the millennials who don't have any of the housing and who weren't engorged with the race run-up of the stock market like the boomers, essentially they're not happy campers. They're like, when they start dominating politics, which they're already starting to do, and they will increasingly, they're going to say, you know what? It's like, we're going to kind of redistribute this differently. We're going to rechannel this into different kind of things. And so I do think the actual concentration thing will be dealt with, and China's doing it its way. The thing, though, about ill or bad is the technology. I would say this last thing about it, which is, and I talk about it in my piece, is I'd much rather be in the messy Western democracies trying to figure out this next phase of the next 25 years than in the kind of authoritarian or even totalitarian kind of autocracies. Why? Because basically, as messy as this is, and as everyone's screaming, and you got social media and politics is back and forth, and fake news and a million things, in that craziness, it's an open discussion still, and you can actually evolve leadership in the space of new ideas. And, what basically Putin and the autocracies do is they take one person, solidifies power, and Xi just did that in a way which is, which, by the way, tradition in China was that every 10 years they do evolve the leadership. He got rid of that. And because of that, they're locked now in this one-person rule. One person does dumb stuff like their lockdown on the pandemic was a completely dumb idea, but it was his idea. Or Putin, let's invade, Ukraine is his idea, dumb idea. It's like, but they don't have a discussion. They don't have a way to work through those things. We do, as messy as it is. So in the long run, always bet on democracy, always bet on open society. And that's why I'd say what's going to emerge in the West and America in the next 25 years is going to absolutely be the more dominant kind of strain of this. And it won't be just the West, by the way. It's going to be all over the world. But the democracy, the more open conversations around these are going to evolve the right answers rather than the lockdown ones.
All right, Eric Johnson, thanks so much for a remarkable talk. And it is a remarkable time, I think, that we live in. My son was asking me, 17, and I told him, I think that it could well be the case, maybe, that we're in a race between global warming to destroy the planet and the singularity. I mean, we may have seen the harbinger of the singularity. And it's a remarkable time to be alive.
Let me just say one thing about that. I would agree it's a remarkable time to be alive, but I will actually say this to you about the singularity. And I don't know, again, you can debate this. But I spent a lot of time around people at AI and have for many years here. The idea of a generalized intelligence AI, which has the versatility of kind of human intelligence that can move from one thing to adapt and do all kinds of things, to my mind, that is certainly extremely way off. Could happen maybe in the century or something, or in this century potentially, but I don't see that in any. I know there are people like Ray Kurzweil and stuff like that saying it's going to happen in the next 5-10 years or even that. My understanding is the current approach to AI that we have is going to be wow. It's going to wow you. It's going to give you a million different things that are going to be positive about it and kind of use be essentially augment human kind of power. But essentially, they're not going to be running stuff. We're not going to be their kind of slaves. It's not going to have the kind of a capacity of kind of real creative intelligence and dominant intelligence that humans do. It's not out of the question that might happen sometime. I mean, in the long sweep of kind of human history. But I think we're a long way off from that. And a lot of data scientists, a lot of kind of AI people are kind of trying to tamp that down a little bit. The worries of, the Terminator or that kind of stuff, I think is a little far for us to worry about in the next 25 years or even the next potentially 50. But in terms of other things that could do, good and bad, we'll see. Particularly if it's being directed by a creative or clever or evil human intelligence, utilizing that superpower of a kind of a generative. I use the word generative AI. That's kind of what you would call the larger way, I think, of thinking about this. But generative is this kind of current version. General intelligence is what a human has. I think AI is going to be a long way off from that, in my own opinion. And that's where some people at Singularity don't think that's closer than we think. I think it's a longer way off. Go ahead. Oh.
Steve Begg, for a lighter tone, do you think that generative AI will lead to the demise of futurists, or will it make us all equally good futurists?
Here's my thing about this, and every time we get a new technology, or even a new iteration of the technology, everyone gets freaked out about job losses, and oh my God. And I will say this, it will disrupt all of our industry, and particularly the futures kind of decision-making, kind of strategy planners, a bunch of stuff. It's going to be a tool that's going to make its mark in this world, for sure. But I believe, and I think I've got good basis for this, it's just going to push up another notch of kind of what the humans will do. And, it might put some people out of work on the margins and stuff when you have to reinvent yourself at Subway. But in general, what we've found in every one of these, like, when ATMs came in, they thought, oh my God, the poor bank tellers and whatever. It's like there's more people working in banks now than there ever were, right? They just took the humans that were like putting out cash like this all day and bored to tears and just gave them something different to do. It's kind of the same idea that there's a lot of boring ass stuff that humans do in every field. Legal briefs, it's like, you got to get all the old legal briefs behind so the partner can go argue and case, and they got all these kind of people right out of law school that just spent weeks kind of compiling this stuff. That's going to be done by our, generative AI. They're just going to pull that together in like an hour. It'll have, the thing together. But that's fine because those legal guys can kind of then actually go in the field and really deal with human beings and kind of deal with other stuff. Anyhow, I'm just thinking there's going to be a reshuffling of what humans do at this juncture in a broad way, but in a way that I think is going to affect all kinds of stuff. But I'm not freaked out about it. In fact, the other thing I would just say, final little thing about that, because everyone gets worried about the job thing. We don't have enough humans to do the jobs we need. I mean, have you ever, walking around, like every restaurant needs a server. Everybody wants somebody, nobody can hire enough people. It's like, we're already in a tight spot. So I think AI is and robots are gonna save our asses, frankly. It's not gonna take away our jobs. They're gonna do a lot of the stuff that we just don't have people doing. The other thing I think is gonna shift is I think immigration in this country. We're gonna open up to immigration again because we're gonna realize we just, as old people and all the stuff that's gonna happen. Unlike China, which can't open up its borders to immigrants, we could do that, and I think we will. And I think this kind of backlash against it in the last decade is going to dissipate. It is dissipating, and I think we're going to see, because we're going to need people, and we're going to need the machines, and we're going to need the robots. Ultimately, we will welcome the robots, not kind of bow as our overlords. We'll get to order them around. That'll be fun. One last thing? Okay.
Thank you, Landing from GSK, and thank you for that remarkable speech. You basically wrap up what I've learned in last semester about macroeconomics within 1 hour. Wonderful. So my question is about ESG. So it's kind of like a buzzword in the past few years. But what we have observed, like for example, when company trying to come to the point of make the trade-off decision between profit and protecting the environment, etc., they always turn to choose profit. And another one observation was the funds, the green funds. It increased enormously in the past few years, but if we compare with non-green funds, it still had a very, very small portion. And we also see a bunch of gang called anti-ESG folks. So I want to ask your confidence level about ESG and also, the whole climate thing.
So the ESG whole phenomena. So I would say ESG was essentially an investment strategy in that last era. The way I would kind of just laid out the era that worked and not all the subsystems working, that essentially is increasingly, I would say, going away. The way you talked about kind of green investments or clean investments or socially responsible investments in that context was essentially an ESG kind of framework. And so I think there's essentially a pushback on that even now in this transition. I think what we're shifting to in this next era, and I was trying to lay out both the incentives for where the green technology is going, as well as the political majorities coming in and with diversity and all stuff, is those things will go from a marginal, on the margins, yeah, you can still make money and do good as that old system was, into that's essentially how the economy is going to be driving. It's going to be closer to, those will be great investments, in other words, over time. It's kind of still a mental shift, a paradigm shift in terms of what it is. And it's also, I would say, a rearguard action of those people that want to slow that down, to kind of demonize it and slow it down. But I would say what I'm kind of laying out to you is the logic of the next system would say you'd kind of be crazy not to start investing in this stuff. It might not have the same returns like this year or this quarter as exactly what you might do, squeezing the juice out of that old system. But essentially the long-term plays essentially is doing, the same thing happened in the 90s, folks. I mean, this is like a kind of repeat of the digital revolution. I mean, in the mid-90s, we were at Wired Magazine, and people would say, people will never put their credit card on the internet. Nah, who's going to be that stupid to put their credit card on the internet? That'll never happen. No one will buy anything on the internet. This is when we're saying, Amazon could basically run everything by the end, by 2020. It's like you got to kind of let go of the old idea, because people would say, yeah, that's crazy to do that. But to say, you can make that secure pretty fast, and when someone does, it's going to be a lot easier. And by the way, if you just shop online, you don't have to get in your car and do this, and it shows up the next day, and the prices are cheaper. And anyhow, look at what we got. Amazon's running the entire retail, industry right now, and that happened. Some of us saw that and said, yeah, but Just watch when we solve that. It's going to be the same with the ESG thing. It's like, oh, it's not good to put investment in solar energy or kind of electric vehicles. You know, that was the push. I was like, if you don't have money in electric vehicles right now, I don't know what you're doing, because that's, look at the Tesla stock from 2018 went up, it hit $1 trillion for a while. Anyhow, the point is, it's a different mentality. It's a kind of a paradigm shift in your perspective, and more of that's going to happen than not. So don't be fooled by the end game of the last system. Be kind of curious and interested in the emerging game of the next thing, and you'll be a lot better off. And with that, I would say, have a great conference, folks. Good way to kick off the day. I'll be around for a little bit.
So, guys, I think we all want to thank him. He's done a wonderful job, and it's been a very big treat for us at STP to have such a keynote speaker. So thank you, Peter.